Good morning. It's good to share the Word of God with you today from Luke chapter 8. And often when we come to Luke chapter 8, we notice if you use your NIV version, which I believe we do, and also the Chinese Bible, which I use here, the title in Luke chapter 8 is the parable of the sower. And so we often focus on the parable of the sower. And that is the reason why I particularly like Dr. Luke, apart from the fact that he's also a medical doctor. But he pays attention to details that often the other Gospels did not. And that's why today we want to focus on Luke chapter 8, verse 1 to 3. And of course, we know the context here. Jesus was traveling from town to town, from village to village. And of course, there were the famous 12 disciples. It was mentioned here. The 12 were with him, the famous 12. But yet Luke here, in verse 1 to 3, gives attention to other people who were not so well known or not so famous. And of course, here Luke named 3 women that often we kind of skip over or ignore. The first is Mary. The second is Joanna. The third is Susanna. Of course, there were other women as well, not named, but at least 3 women were named. Now, I would like you to use your imagination a little bit. Of course, imagination means it's not recorded in the Bible. Just imagine. Imagine you were there at the village. You were there listening to Jesus preaching. And Jesus just finished preaching, and it was getting ready to get to another town or village. And the crowd there say, "Hang on, Jesus, don't leave yet." Why? Oh, we want to take a group photo. Of course, this is of course the modern version. This is not recorded in the Bible. Just imagine if they were to take a group photo. I could imagine that Jesus probably would be standing at the center. I hope so, for the photo. But I will ask one question. Who do you think would be standing one on the left and one on the right? Of course, I don't know. This is imagination. But of course, you know that in Mark chapter 10, there were 2 disciples, the sons of Zebedee, James and John. Now, Jesus just told them in Mark chapter 10 that he was about to die on the cross. And these 2 disciples came to Jesus and say, "Teacher, when you come in glory, allow us to sit one on your left and one on your right." And the Bible told us that the other 10 disciples were what? Very upset. Who do you think you were? One wanting to be on the left and one on the right. Just think about this, that the disciples had been following Jesus for 3 years. And Jesus just told them he was about to die. And all they were concerned about was position, status, and recognition. And that's particularly relevant as we now come back to Luke chapter 8, verse 1 to 3, what I call these 3 women, the unexpected servants of Jesus Christ. Often we kind of skip over and ignore them. And today we want to study them a little bit more. First of all, Mary. In verse 2, we were told that Mary called Magdalene. Have you thought about what that means? Why did Luke tell us that Mary called Magdalene? If you use another translation, it's called Mary of Magdala. That's the translation, Mary of Magdala. Now, just use an example to illustrate the point. My name is Patrick Fung, at least in English, Patrick Fung. If I tell you that I am Patrick Fung of Soldier Bazaar, you probably won't know what I'm talking about. Soldier Bazaar, what is that? That is a little town I work in. I lived in Soldier Bazaar for a number of years in Pakistan, in a city called Karachi. We were working among the Muslim people, and the place was called Soldier Bazaar. Soldier Bazaar is not a famous place at all. Small town. Nothing famous except one thing. Camels. We have a camel station in front of our house. So every day I went to work, I could greet the camels. Now camels in those days, well, even now, they are not for tourists. They were to carry heavy cargo, right, camels. Susa Bazaar is not a famous place. And what Luke is telling us is that Mary of Magdala is a small fishing village in Galilee. Unknown, not a famous place, not London, not All Souls. Small town, small fishing village. And Luke says, this woman came from such a small place, not noticed by people. And she was the one following Jesus and serving Jesus. But more than that, Luke told us also something else as well. It says, from whom 7 demons had come out. I really like the translation here because it's very, very accurate. It was in the past tense. She was tormented by evil spirits. Just imagine her life, living in darkness, tormented by evil spirits, had come out, meaning her life has been transformed. And of course, Luke didn't tell us all the details, but most likely her life was healed by Jesus. She was a totally broken person, unfit for anything, really. And yet her life is changed. Had come out, meaning now her life is different. She can serve Jesus. I thought about Mary, quite a bit. I thought, who is really qualified to serve Jesus? People will be thinking, is she mentally all right? Is she well? And yet, the Bible tells us that she was following Jesus. So the first qualification to serve Jesus is not my degree, it's not my talent, it's not my gifts, my abilities, but a grateful heart. Mary, I'm sure, she served Jesus with a grateful heart. She probably would not be like the 12 disciples leading from the front on the stage, probably not. But I can imagine, I could see her mingling with the crowds and telling people, do you have a minute? I can tell you how Jesus transformed my life. Now, there's an old hymn. I don't know whether we sing it here as well. The name of the hymn is, I have a story to tell the nations. Actually, we have the best story to tell the nations. Let no one tell you that, look, you're not qualified. You don't have such and such gifts or degrees or talents. But no, the first qualification is a grateful heart, because our lives have been transformed by Jesus Christ. We have the best story to tell the nations. Just now, at the interview, I told you that I work with OMF International, formerly the China Inland Mission, founded by Hudson Taylor in 1865. Now, in those days, to send missionaries from England to China was not easy. To send people from Liverpool to Shanghai, you know how long it took the journey in a boat? 5 months. Today, you travel 12 hours. You're there somewhere else in different parts of the world. But in those days, in a boat, 5 months of journey. It's never easy. So to have anyone join the China Inland Mission, everybody should be happy. But not with one person. A young man applied to the China Inland Mission in 1866. His name was George Stott. He went for the interview 3 times. He failed the test. They did not let him go to China. And so he made an appeal. He said, please let me meet with Hudson Taylor myself, personally. He said, okay, sure. Now I'll let you meet Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor met him, say the same thing and say, brother, I think you should stay back in Britain. You better just pray for the Chinese people. I don't think you should go to China. You say, why? Because when he walked into the room, everybody was shocked. He walked into the room with one leg. Because when he was young, he had a severe infection in the left leg, and the doctor has to amputate his left leg. People saw him and say, look, going to China is not easy. To survive in China is not easy. How can you survive with one leg? You just cannot go. You should not go. But this is what George Stott said to Hudson Taylor. He said, here in Britain, there are many people with 2 legs, but they are not going to China. Please allow me to go to China with 1 leg. That so moved Hudson Taylor He said, okay, we'll send you. So he was sent to a place called Wenzhou. Wenzhou, if you're familiar with China, is the coastal area in the south. In those days, Wenzhou had no church and very few Christians. 1866. 160 years later today, Wenzhou has 7 million people. 10% of the Wenzhou people are Christians today. I don't think George Stott could ever imagine 160 years later how God will raise up the church in Wenzhou in China and use the Wenzhou people to spread the gospel to different parts of the world. Humanly speaking, George Stott was totally unqualified. And God allows him to go. Like Mary, she was tormented by the evil spirits. She had evil spirits in her before. Was she really qualified? I thought about the life of Mary. I thought about George Stott. God does not call the qualified. God qualifies the call. And that is the first qualification, a grateful heart. Now we come to the second person, Joanna. Now, if we think about Mary, living in darkness before, tormented by the evil spirit, had a terrible life in the past, I think Joanna is probably just the opposite spectrum, the opposite. She probably had a good life, a comfortable life. Now, why did I say that? If you read verse 3, Joanna, the wife of Cusa, the manager of Herod's household. Her husband's name was Cusa, and Cusa worked for Herod. Now, who is Herod anyway? In Luke chapter 3, we are told that Herod, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod was tetrarch of Galilee. What does that mean? Of course, we know that in those days, the whole area was ruled by Caesar, the Roman Empire. And then Caesar assigned the area Judea to Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate assigned Galilee to Herod. Herod is very much like the mayor of today, like mayor of London, mayor of New York, or of Toronto, something like that. And so Joanna probably has a fairly comfortable life. If your husband works for the mayor, you'll probably pay very, very well. If you think about the first qualification I mentioned about Mary is a grateful heart. The second qualification is a willing service, willingness. Joanna was willing to go beyond her comfort zone. As I think about All Souls, I've been here several times. All Souls has a lot of gifted, able people. But God is not looking just for the able people, able servants. God is looking for the available. There could be many able people in All Souls. But if we are not available to God, God cannot use us and will not use us. You need to be available. I told you in my testimony just now, I became a Christian in Sydney, 1977. That was a year that really changed my life. I came to know the Lord, Jesus Christ. And since then, the Lord used one verse in the Bible which really challenged me until now, even until now. Very simple verse from Proverbs 23:26. 4 words in English and 4 words exactly in Chinese as well. And the words were in Proverbs 23:26. Give me your heart, my son. Give me your heart. 将心归我. That was in Chinese. What God wanted from me was not my degrees, my talents, my gifts, but God says, first of all, give me your heart. And I believe God is saying the same thing to us today in All Souls, to All Souls. Give me your heart. I mentioned about the China Inland Mission, established in 1865. In 1879, there was one graduate from Oxford University. And when he graduated, he received many awards. A brilliant doctor, a medical doctor, graduate from Oxford. And the university really liked him and say, please, we want to invite you to come and stay at Oxford, do medical research. And we are quite sure you will become a professor one day. Brilliant doctor. But he declined the invitation. He said, God is calling me to China. So he applied to the China in admission, just like George thought. But interestingly, according to the record, he also failed the interview. I thought that's interesting. I understand, if you have one leg, you can't go. But what about this guy from the best university, Oxford, brilliant doctor, graduate, loved to go to China for mission work? Why did they not allow him to go? And I found the answer right here in London at SOAS. If you go to SOAS, you will find the record at the archive department in SOAS, London University. The exact record in handwritten record, right there in SOAS. The record was this. The interview, the committee liked him a lot. Everything was good. Brilliant doctor, loved the Lord, willing to serve God in China. Except one thing. He was single and not married. And they thought, at least in those days, they thought the single man from Britain could not survive very well in China. They say, go back, pray for a wife. If God gives you a wife, then come back for the second interview. That was the record. Interesting. And of course, I had the record with me, and you just keep turning the pages, and you found the answer. There was a second interview. 5 months later. That was quick. And the first line say, 3:30 p.m., we had tea with Dr. Schofield. Having tea is very, very important, of course, here. The second line was this. Dr. Schofield is now married. So everybody was very happy. They sent him to China, to a place called Taiyuan. 1880, he arrived in China with his wife. 1883, August, according to the record, he was treating a patient. He was there as a missionary doctor, looking after patients in the hospital. And of course, looking back, we now know that the patient had some kind of infection, and Dr. Schofield got that infection from the patient. 2 weeks later, he died. At the age of 32. When I read that record, I was totally shocked. I say, Lord, why did you allow him only to live 32 years? If he, was there longer in China, he could serve God, more chance to share with other people, more people about the gospel of Jesus Christ. Why did you allow him only to live 32 years? That's very short. A brilliant doctor. And yet the Lord reminded me of his own words in John chapter 12. You remember Jesus said, very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. If it dies, it produces many seeds. The Lord is sovereign. And when I examine in more details the church history of China, I could see God's grace, God's mercy, God's sovereign rule, even in that event. Because of Dr. Schofield's life, his life impacted so many more young people in those days from Britain to go to China, to give their lives for the Chinese people for the sake of the gospel. Now, we all know what a tombstone looks like. I hope you know. The name, 2 dates, right? Date of birth, date of death. What's usually in between the 2 dates? There's a line, a dash, right? A dash. I thought about that dash a lot, the tombstone. Think about it a little bit. Have you seen people who live longer would have a longer dash? And live shorter with a shorter dash? You probably say no, right? It's about the same. So this makes me think a little bit more. What is important is not the length of that dash, no. What is important is what you put into that dash, what you invest in that dash. I think God is saying the same to us today. And what do you invest in that, in your life, in that one line? Whether 32 years or 60 years or 80 years, the important thing is not the duration, but what you put into that dash. God is not looking just for the able. There are many here. God is looking for the available, being available to God. A willing service. The first, a grateful heart. Second, a willing service. Finally, Susanna. Now we come to the third person, Susanna. It's interesting that depends on the version you use. And here, the NIV is just a semicolon, Susanna, a semicolon. Some Bible says, and Susanna, but there's no and even in the original text. Just Susanna. And I was just a little bit not happy with Dr. Luke. The reason is this. I said, Luke, you told us about this name, Susanna. What did she do? What was she good at? Was she a good cook? I don't know. What did she do for Jesus? You told us nothing about her. Why did you mention that name? What could I learn from this person? As if nothing. But then I paused and thought about it. I said, no, there is something I could learn. There's a very important spiritual lesson I could learn from this name. And that is this. Often when I serve God, I want people to remember what I have done, not what Jesus has done for them and me. The focus often is on me. I am the main character. I want people to remember me much more than what God, Jesus, has done for me and them. And so the third qualification, apart from a grateful heart, a willing service, perhaps here, Susanna, is a humble spirit, humility. God is looking for humble servants, a humble spirit. Now, I mentioned about Dr. Scofield just now, and Scofield really, his life encouraged so many more people from England in those days, from Britain, to go to China. And of course, one of them, not one, but 7 of them responded, which later on came to be known as the Cambridge 7. You probably have heard of the Cambridge 7. 7 young men from Cambridge all went to China at the same time in 1885. Now, one of the Cambridge 7 is by the name of Dixon Holmes, from a very wealthy family. The family is extremely wealthy, the nobles. And yet he was sent to one of the poorest areas in China, in Shanxi, to work among the opium addicts. In those days, Britain was selling a lot of opium to China. A lot of people suffer. And one of the works of the China Inner Mission was to help these opium addicts to come out of opium addiction. And he was sent by the China Inner Mission to work among these people, sent to Shanxi province. One day he wrote a letter to his mother. In the letter he said this. He said, Mom, living here is not easy. Summer is very hot. I do not have my own room. I live with more than these 100 opium addicts. All these, I live with them in the same room, day in, day out. I was with them the whole time. I do not have my own room. And yet he said, you know what? I thought I have laid everything before the cross before I came to China. I surrendered everything. But today God challenged me. There is one more thing you need to surrender before the cross. And that is my personal space. I need to surrender before the cross. I do not have my own personal space. I need to surrender my personal space before God. He arrived in China at the age of 25. He left China at the age of 85. 60 years in China. Just cannot imagine. He basically gave his whole life to the Chinese people for the sake of the gospel. At the age of 86, he went back to England. Within 1 year, he died. And people really missed him. They love him. The Chinese people love him. And the missionaries love him. They kind of missed him. And they say, what do we remember about him? What do we remember him? And say they began to write different things. Interestingly, without comparing notes, different people wrote, and there was a convergence of opinion about Dixon Edward Holmes, a convergence from different people. And this convergence came into just one line to describe him. One line. Now, what I'm going to share with you is not from Holmes himself. It is mentioned by people who knew Holmes. And this is what they say. He is Dixon Holmes. He lived to be forgotten so that Christ can be remembered. He lived to be forgotten so that Christ can be remembered. For his whole life, Holmes served with a humble spirit in China for 60 years. So today I believe that God is still calling people, servants of his, those with a grateful heart, a willing service, and a humble spirit. God does not call the qualified, but God qualifies the called. And God is not just looking for the able, God is looking for the available. And I want to end by quoting Proverbs 23:26 again, the 4 words I mentioned to you. And I believe God is saying the same thing to us today. He has been saying to me, give me your heart. And perhaps God is asking us today, are you available? Are you willing? And I pray that your response is, yes, Lord, here I am. I'm willing and I'm available. Amen.